At the company Christmas party, someone called Caleb Dawson's name over the microphone, and the room laughed before he even stood up. He was the warehouse guy, the quiet one, the man nobody remembered unless something needed lifting or moving. They watched him walk toward the stage with the kind of attention people not out of respect, but out of curiosity. He took the microphone, and then he sang, and no one laughed again. Nobody at Harbor Line Supply could have told you much about Caleb Dawson. Beyond the basics, he worked the warehouse floor, he showed up on time, and he never caused problems. That was the entirety of his reputation. In a company of over 200 employees, spread across 3 floors of offices, sales teams and logistics coordinators, Caleb existed somewhere in the margins. He moved freight-managed loading schedules, filed inventory reports that nobody read twice. He did his job, and he went home, and the next morning he came back and did it again. He was 34 years old and looked like a man who had learned not to expect much from a room full of people, not bitter about it, just adjusted. There was a particular way he carried himself through the office hallways. On the rare occasions he had to pass through them, head slightly down, shoulders. Neutral, the walk of someone who had long since decided that blending in was easier than standing out. His co-workers in the warehouse knew him well enough to share a joke or two on slow afternoons. But the people upstairs, the managers, the account executives, the ones who got invited to the quarterly dinners, those people barely registered his name. He had been at Harbor Line for 6 years. 6 years of steady, unremarkable service. His supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Greg Mercer, who ran operations on the ground floor, had written him a solid performance review each year. Reliable, consistent, detail-oriented. The words that describe a man the company would miss only after he was gone. Greg was fair with him, occasionally checked in on how things were going, and seemed to genuinely respect the work Caleb put in. But even Greg didn't know much about who Caleb was outside those warehouse walls. What none of them knew was that Caleb Dawson had once wanted something very different from his life. Years ago, before Harbor Line, before the warehouse, before everything shifted, music had been the one place where he felt fully himself. He had sung since he was a teenager, not for audiences or applause, but because it was the only thing that ever made silence feel comfortable. His voice was something he had discovered quietly, the way some people discover they're good at painting or fixing engines. It wasn't trained, wasn't polished, but it was real, and for a period in his late 20s, he had believed it might become something more. That period ended when his wife Rachel got sick. The details of those years were not something Caleb talked about, and they were not something he carried openly on his face. But they were there. Rachel had been the person who pushed him toward music when he wanted to stop, who sat in the back of small venues with a coffee, and told him afterward exactly what she thought, honestly. Always honestly. When she died, he put everything related to singing into a box, not dramatically, not with any grand decision, but slowly, the way grief works. One day the guitar was in the closet. Then it was gone. And then years passed, and he didn't think about it much anymore. He had a life to maintain, a job to keep, a routine that held everything together. He was not unhappy exactly. He was simply a man who had made peace with a narrow world and learned to find enough in it to keep going. The year-end Christmas party was held on a Friday evening in mid-December. At a banquet hall, the company rented 2 blocks from the main office. Harbor Line did this every year, rented the space, set up a buffet, hired a DJ, arranged a karaoke setup in the corner that never got used until at least the 3rd hour when the drinks had been flowing long enough. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but it was the kind of event where absence was quietly noted. Caleb went because not going would have drawn more attention than going. He sat with a few of the guys from the warehouse men he genuinely liked, who talked about football and complained about the new inventory software, and didn't ask too many personal questions. It was comfortable in the way that familiar things are comfortable. He ate, he had one drink, and he watched the room do what rooms like this always do. The executives gravitating toward each other near the bar, the middle managers loosening their ties, the younger staff crowding near the karaoke machine, and cheering each other on with the exaggerated enthusiasm of people trying to prove they were fun. Brandon Hale was exactly the kind of person who made events like this louder than they needed to be. He worked in sales third floor and had the particular energy of someone who had never once doubted whether he belonged in a room. He wasn't cruel by nature, that would be too simple. He was the kind of person who found amusement in other people's discomfort, without ever quite registering it as cruelty. To him, it was all just entertainment, lightening the mood, having a laugh. It was Brandon who had been circling the karaoke sign-up sheet all evening, filling it with names, some willing, some not. He had a talent for reading the room and knowing exactly who would get a reaction. And when he looked across the banquet hall and spotted Caleb Dawson sitting quietly at the edge of a table near the warehouse crew, something about it seemed to amuse him. The quiet guy, the invisible one, the man nobody could picture doing anything unexpected. He wrote Caleb's name on the list. The MC, one of the younger HR staff who had been handed the job with a handheld microphone and too much enthusiasm, called the name out with the same bright energy she had used for everyone else. But the reaction in the room was different. There was a beat of confusion, and then a ripple of laughter, not loud, not vicious, just the easy laughter of a crowd that had already decided the joke before it even started. A few people craned their necks to find him. Someone at Brandon's table said something under their breath, and Brandon grinned. Caleb heard his name. He felt the shift in the room before he fully processed what was happening, the way the energy changed, the laughter, the eyes turning in his direction. He understood immediately. He wasn't slow. He knew what this was. He sat still for a moment. His drink was in his hand, and he looked at it. Not dramatically, just the way a man looks at something familiar when he's trying to steady himself. The warehouse guys at his table glanced at him with the kind of expressions that said they didn't know what to do either, whether to laugh along or look away or say something. The MC called his name again, brighter this time, drawing it out with a cheerful lilt that made the laughter build a little more. Every part of his body was telling him to shake his head, to wave it off, to say he'd pass, and let the moment die quietly, the way most moments did when they involved him. That was the reasonable thing, the safe thing, the thing that kept his world exactly as small and manageable as he had arranged it to be. He set his drink down on the table. He stood up. The laughter didn't stop, if anything. It grew slightly because the act of standing up was itself the beginning of the joke. People were watching now, not just the table near Brandon, but others around the room, drawn by the shift in attention the way people always are when they sense something is about to be embarrassing. Diane Foster, one of the senior coordinators from the second floor, who had been standing near the dessert table with a glass of wine, turned to look. A few of the executives near the bar glanced over. Caleb walked toward the stage. He didn't walk fast or slow. He didn't look at the floor. He looked straight ahead, which was itself a small act of something. Not defiance, not performance, just a refusal to pretend the walk wasn't happening. The banquet hall was not large, but it felt long in that moment. Every step was visible. Every step was part of the joke that Brandon had built. He reached the stage. The MC handed him the microphone with a smile that was half encouraging and half unsure. The song list was already cued. Brandon had picked something clearly, because Caleb hadn't signed up for anything himself. He looked at the screen. He looked at the microphone in his hand. The opening bars began to play from the speakers, soft at first, filling the background hum of the room. And Caleb Dawson, warehouse worker widower, a man who had spent 6 years making himself invisible in this building, stood on that small stage in front of the entire company and made a decision that no one in that room, including himself, had fully anticipated. He brought the microphone to his lips, and he chose to sing. The first note came out smaller than he intended. Not weak, not broken, just contained like something that had been kept in a closed space for a very long time and hadn't yet remembered how to expand. The opening bars of the song moved through the speakers, and Caleb's voice met them carefully, finding the melody the way a person finds their footing on unfamiliar ground. A few people at the tables near the front were still smiling, still carrying the momentum of whatever they had found funny 30 seconds ago. Someone near the back made a comment that drew a short laugh from the people around them. The room had not yet decided to take him seriously, and he could feel that the collective weight of an audience that had already written the ending before the story began. He had not sung in front of people in years. The last time had been so long ago that the memory of it felt like it belonged to someone else, a younger man in a different life with Rachel in the back row, coffee in her hand, watching him with that steady expression. She had the one that said she was paying attention to every word. That memory surfaced without invitation, and he let it pass through him without holding it the way he had learned to do. There was no space for it here. There was only the microphone, the music, and the 200 people who were waiting for him to fail. His voice was low at first, moving through the verse, with a restraint that some people might have mistaken for nervousness. And maybe part of it was. But there was something else underneath the restraint, something that had been sealed off for a long time and was now very slowly beginning to unseal. The muscles in his chest loosened in a way he hadn't anticipated. His shoulders dropped half an inch. The hand holding the microphone steadied. And when he reached the end of the first verse and moved into the chorus, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with any visible announcement, but in the way that a tide shifts. Gradual, inevitable, impossible to stop once it had started. His voice opened. It was the only way to describe it. One moment it was careful and contained, and the next it was something else entirely deeper, fuller, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with truth. The notes he hit were not the notes of a man performing for a crowd. They were the notes of a man who had lived inside something painful for a very long time and had found entirely by accident the one place where that pain had a shape. The room felt it before it understood it. That was the strange thing about a voice. Like that, it reached people at a level below. Thought below the part of the brain that decides whether to be impressed. It simply arrived. And the people in that banquet hall had no real defense against it. The laughter stopped in sections. First, the people closet to the stage who could feel the acoustics change as his voice expanded. Then the tables in the middle, where the shift in atmosphere traveled like a slow current. Then the back of the room, where conversations had been continuing in low murmurs. Those dropped off too, one by one, until the only sound in the entire hall was Caleb Dawson's voice, moving through a song that no one had expected to matter. Diane Foster, who had turned to look with nothing more than mild curiosity when his name was called, was now standing completely still near the edge of the room. Her wine glass was in her hand, but she had stopped drinking. She was watching the stage with the expression of someone recalibrating, resorting everything they thought they knew about a situation. She had seen Caleb in the building before, had nodded at him in the elevator, maybe exchanged 2 sentences total over the course of however many years he had worked there. She had held no particular opinion of him. She understood now, in the specific, slightly uncomfortable way, that genuine surprise works, that she had simply never looked. At Brandon Hale's table, the reaction was quieter and harder to read. Brandon had started the evening in the position of someone who controlled the joke, who knew the punchline before anyone else. That position required a certain posture, a certain readiness to perform amusement for the people around him. But now the joke had done something he had not designed it to do. The room was not laughing. The room was listening, and Brandon sat with his drink in front of him, and his expression doing something complicated, the way a person's face does when the ground shifts under a conclusion they were certain of. He didn't leave. He didn't look away either. He just sat there, and his face slowly settled into something that was neither amusement nor embarrassment, but a kind of quiet that was new for him in a room like this. Caleb sang through the chorus a second time, and the fullness in his voice did not diminish it. Built controlled and deliberate the way a man builds something when he knows exactly what he's doing, even if no one around him expects it. He was not showing off. That was the thing that made it land the way it did. There was no performance in the theatrical sense, no reaching for effect, no awareness of his own impact that could be read on his face. He was simply singing, and the honesty of that, the bare, undecorated honesty of a man standing on a stage doing something true, was what the room could not look away from. When the last note settled and the music faded from the speakers, the banquet hall was silent for a full 3 seconds. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of 200 people who had just been somewhere unexpected and hadn't yet found their way back. Then the applause started, and it was not polite. It was the kind of applause that surprises the people doing it, that begins somewhere involuntary and spreads before anyone consciously decides to join. People were standing at a few of the tables near the front. Someone let out a sharp whistle from the back. The MC, who had been standing off to the side with her microphone at her side, looked genuinely shaken in the pleasant way that people look when something has exceeded every expectation they carried into a room. Caleb lowered the microphone. He stood on that stage, and he looked at the room not with triumph, not with the expression of a man savoring a reversal. He looked at it the way someone looks at something they are still catching up to. He handed the microphone back to the MC, stepped off the stage, and walked back toward his table. The applause followed him the entire way. What happened next was harder to navigate than the performance itself. People came over, not all at once in waves the way attention tends to move in social situations when it has been redirected towards someone who wasn't holding it before. Some of them were genuine, a woman from the HR department who introduced herself as someone who had worked on the same floor for 3 years and admitted she had never heard anything like that. A man from logistics, someone Caleb had worked adjacent to without ever really knowing who shook his hand too firmly, and said something like, "I had no idea, man," in a tone that meant to be complimentary, but also revealed without meaning to how low his expectations had been. Others were more awkward. A few of the people who had been laughing near Brandon's table now appeared at the edges of Caleb's space, with expressions that didn't quite know what to do with themselves. They smiled too hard. They said the right things in the wrong tone. One of them, a younger woman from sales, whose name Caleb had never learned, told him it was so amazing. 3 times in the same 30-second conversation, the repetition betraying the fact that she was not quite sure what else to offer someone she had underestimated so completely. Caleb was polite with all of them. He was not cold, not distant, not performing graciousness. He simply did not know how to receive this kind of attention, and so he handled it the only way available to him, carefully, quietly, without letting it mean too much. He said thank you. He nodded when people said things that deserved a nod. He did not tell them they were forgiven, because it had never occurred to him to think in those terms. He was just a man standing in a room that was looking at him differently than it had an hour ago, and the looking felt strange, in a way that had nothing to do with resentment. It felt strange, the way any unfamiliar thing feels strange, not bad, just disorienting. Greg Mercer found him about 20 minutes after the performance, when the initial wave of attention had settled, and people had drifted back into their own conversations, the party resuming its natural rhythm around the new thing it had witnessed. Greg was not a man who made speeches or offered compliments easily, which was part of why Caleb had always respected him. He set a drink on the table in front of Caleb without asking if he wanted. Wanda sat down in the chair across from him and looked at him for a moment in the straightforward way that men like Greg tended to look at things they were deciding how to address. "I've worked with you for 4 years, Greg said. "I didn't know." Caleb looked at the drink. "Most people don't." Greg nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something he had been thinking. He told Caleb that his cousin ran a small event production company, nothing large, just local venues, corporate events, private functions. They were always looking for performers for background sets, sometimes for featured slots, when something more formal was needed. It wasn't a career. It wasn't a contract or a promise of anything significant. But it was real, and it was paid. And Greg said he could make an introduction if Caleb was interested. He said it simply without pressure, the way a man offers something he believes has value without needing to oversell it. Caleb listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt, didn't deflect, didn't immediately say no the way he might have done 2 hours ago. He sat with the offer and turned it over in his mind, while Greg waited comfortable enough in the quiet not to fill it. The practical reality of it was straightforward enough to outline he had a job with stable hours and a paycheck he could depend on. He had a life that, while narrow, was functional. The warehouse was something he knew how to manage. The logistics of Harbor Line were something he understood. Stepping into anything new, even something as low stakes as Greg was describing, meant exposure. It meant putting himself in front of strangers with the expectation that his voice was worth their attention. It meant existing visibly in a way that he had spent years training himself not to do. And underneath all of that, underneath the practical considerations and the logistical concerns, there was the real thing, the fear that if he tried something might go wrong in a way that confirmed what part of him had always suspected, that the version of himself who believed in his own voice had died somewhere in those years with Rachel, and what remained was not enough to build anything new from. That fear wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with any particular weight or declaration. It sat quietly in the back of his chest, the way it always had, and waited for him to make a decision. He looked at Greg across the table. Greg was watching him without impatience, a man who had learned that the most useful thing you can offer someone in a difficult moment is time. The party continued around the music from the DJ voices, overlapping the sound of a room that had moved on to the next thing, while Caleb sat at the center of a choice that no one else could see. He thought about the stage, about the way his voice had felt when it opened, not like something he was doing, but like something he had stopped preventing. He thought about the 3 seconds of silence after the last note, and how that silence had felt different from every other silence he had carried through 6 years of making himself invisible. Those 3 seconds had not been empty. They had been full of something. He didn't have a clean name for something that sat just on the other side of the grief he had packed away in a box and put in the back of the closest and called a decision. He had not felt that in a very long time. He told Greg he would think about it. Not. Yes. Not. No. Something genuinely in between, which was itself a departure from the man who had walked into this banquet hall 3 hours earlier with every intention of staying exactly where he had always been. Greg nodded, picked up his own drink, and said there was no rush. The offer would stand. He left Caleb at the table, and Caleb sat alone for a moment in the noise of the party and felt the full weight of the evening settle on him. He had walked into this room as one thing, and he was sitting in it now as something slightly different, and the difference was not entirely comfortable. Comfort had been the whole point of the life he had built, the narrow, manageable, dependable life that asked nothing of him beyond what he already knew how to give. And now there was this, a door that had opened from the outside by accident, by someone else's cruelty, repurposed into something he hadn't asked for, and he was sitting in front of it and trying to decide whether a man like him was the kind of man who walked through doors or the kind who looked at them long enough to convince himself they were walls. He didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in years, he was sitting with the question instead of moving away from it. And that in its own quiet way was already something new. He called Greg 3 days later, not because the decision had become easy, but because he had spent those 3 days sitting with the alternative, returning to the exact life he had before the party, pretending the evening had been a small, strange thing that happened, and then passed, and found that he couldn't make it fit anymore. The shape of it was wrong. He had tried to step back into the familiar routine of early mornings and inventory reports and the careful invisibility he had maintained for years, and it was like trying to wear a coat that no longer fit across the shoulders. Something had shifted in a way that couldn't be unshifted, and the only question left was what he was going to do with that. So he called Greg from the parking lot of Harborline on a Tuesday morning before his shift started, sitting in his car with the engine still running. He told Greg he was interested in meeting the cousin. Nothing more than that. Not a declaration, not a commitment, just a door opened 1 inch further than it had been. Greg said he'd make the call that afternoon. His voice carried the particular evenness of a man who had expected this answer and was careful not to make too much of it, which Caleb appreciated more than he could have articulated. The meeting with Greg's cousin, a compact and direct woman named Sandra Mercer, who ran her event company out of a small office on the east side of the city, happened the following week. Caleb went on his lunch break still in his work clothes and sat across from her at a desk covered in scheduling binders and laminated venue floor plans. Sandra was not the kind of person who wasted time on pleasantries. She asked him to describe his experience. He told her honestly that he had none in any professional sense, and she nodded, like that was fine. Greg had described the performance at the party, and Sandra operated on the principle that a recommendation from someone she trusted was worth more than a resume. She told him she had 2 corporate events in January that needed background performers for dinner sets, low pressure, small rooms, 2 hours each, $150 per set. She handed him a card and told him to let her know by Friday. He let her know by Thursday. The first event was a private dinner for a financial services firm at a hotel ballroom in the second week of January. 40 people round tables with white linens, the kind of crowd that was more interested in their conversations than in whoever was providing the background music. Caleb arrived early, set up with the small sound system Sandra's team had arranged, and stood in the corner of the room in a dark jacket he had not worn since Rachel's funeral and had quietly pressed the night before. When the guests began filing in, nobody looked at him. Not because they were being rude, simply because he was the music, and people at events like that tend not to look at the music unless it asks them to. He sang for 2 hours. He moved through a set of songs he had chosen carefully over the preceding week, sitting at his kitchen table with a notepad and a streaming service, and the particular focus of a man who had not allowed himself to think seriously about music in years and was now finding that the knowledge was still there intact, waiting patiently in a part of his memory he had not visited in a long time. His voice held through the full set without faltering. Somewhere in the second hour, a woman at one of the tables near the front turned around and looked at him directly. Not the vague glance people give background performers, but the attentive look of someone who has been pulled out of their conversation by something they didn't expect. She didn't say anything. She just listened for a moment, then turned back to her table. But Caleb saw it, and something in him registered it quietly and held it. He drove home that night with $150 in an envelope on the passenger seat and the specific tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from having used something real. He sat in his car outside his apartment for a moment before going in, and he thought about Rachel, not with the grief that used to arrive like a weight, but with something gentler, something that felt in its strange way like gratitude. She had always known this about him. She had known it before he fully knew it himself, and she had told him so plainly in the way she told him everything. He had put it away when he lost her because it belonged to the life they had built together, and he hadn't known how to carry it alone. He understood now that putting it away had been its own kind of loss, separate from hers, but connected to it. He understood now that he was allowed to pick it back up. Back at Harborline, things were different in ways both visible and not. The visible changes were small people who had never registered his existence, now said his name when they passed him in the hallway. A few stopped to talk real conversations, not the performative kind that had followed the party, but the easier kind that happens when people have simply reclassified someone in their minds and adjusted accordingly. The woman from HR who had introduced herself at the party occasionally waved at him across the break room. Even some of the people from the upper floors, the account managers and coordinators he had shared a building with for 6 years, without exchanging more than a nod, now looked at him with a recognition that hadn't been there before. The less visible change was in Caleb himself. He still came to work on time, still managed the loading schedules and inventory reports with the same reliability that Greg had noted in every annual review. The job had not changed, and he had not decided to pretend it was something other than what it was. But the way he moved through the building was different. Not louder, not more visible in any way that called attention to itself, just different in the internal way that things are different when a person has stopped apologizing for their own presence. He didn't look at the floor when he passed through the office hallways anymore. He didn't arrange himself to take up as little space as possible. He simply walked the way a man walks when he has accepted that he has as much right to the room as anyone else in it. Brandon Hale passed him in the corridor one afternoon, in late January, about 6 weeks after the party. Brandon was with 2 people from his sales team mid-conversation, the usual forward momentum of a man who moved through the office like he owned the air in it. He saw Caleb and his stride adjusted not dramatically, just the small adjustment of a person who has encountered something they haven't fully processed and isn't sure what the correct posture is. He gave Caleb a nod. Not the dismissive nod of a man who has already moved on, but the slightly uncertain nod of someone who is still working out what they owe and to whom. Caleb returned it without hostility, without anything extra, just a nod, back clean and even, and kept walking. That was all. No confrontation, no resolved speech, no moment of formal acknowledgement. But something in the plainness of that exchange felt more honest than any of the elaborate dynamics that had preceded it, and Caleb walked away from it, carrying nothing he hadn't already set down. Sandra booked him for 2 more events in February. He said yes to both without deliberating for 3 days first. He was still a warehouse worker. He was still getting up at 6 in the morning and managing freight logistics and eating lunch at the same table with the same guys who talked about football and complained about the inventory software. His paycheck was the same. His apartment was the same. The life he had built around the edges of his grief was structurally unchanged, and he had no illusions about what a few evening performance sets actually meant in the broader picture of things. He was not building a new identity. He was not becoming a different person. He was becoming a more complete version of the one he had always been. That was the thing about the performance at the party, the thing that nobody who had watched it fully understood, including the people who had been most affected by it. It hadn't been a revelation about Caleb Dawson's talent. The talent had always been there unchanged, waiting in the same interior space where he had sealed it away. What the party had revealed, what that stage and that microphone and Brandon Hale's careless joke had accidentally forced into the open, was the fact that Caleb had been choosing not to be seen. Not because the world had taken that choice from him, but because somewhere in the long aftermath of losing Rachel, he had decided that smallness was safer than exposure, and invisibility was easier than the risk of being seen and found insufficient. He had been wrong about that, not catastrophically wrong, not in a way that demanded grief or self-recrimination, just wrong in the quiet, ordinary way that people are wrong about themselves when they have been carrying something heavy for too long and have forgotten that they can put it down. He was putting it down now. Slowly, without ceremony, in the way that real things tend to happen, not in the dramatic single moment that makes a good story, but in the accumulation of small choices made one at a time. A phone call from a parking lot, a meeting over a lunch break, A card handed to Sandra on a Thursday instead of a Friday. A nod in a corridor that carried nothing but its own plainness. A dark jacket pressed the night before a performance for a room that wasn't even looking. None of it was loud. None of it required an audience. It was just a man deciding for the first time in a long time that the life inside him was worth the trouble of living it out loud. And he walked into each morning after that with exactly that quiet, unhurried, and sure.